The 1556 Shaanxi Earthquake in China stands as the most devastating seismic event in recorded human history. Striking the early morning hours of January 23rd, this disaster tore through the densely populated Wei River Valley in north-central China with unimaginable force. Entire villages vanished within seconds as the ground cracked open and landslides buried homes and farmland. What made this quake particularly catastrophic wasn't just its estimated magnitude, around 8.0 on the modern scale, but the vulnerability of the people. Many lived in artificially carved cave dwellings called yaodongs, built into soft loess cliffs. These structures were widespread due to the region's geography and tradition, but under seismic pressure, they collapsed instantly, entombing thousands. Historical accounts from the Ming Dynasty describe the destruction as absolute. Cracks split the land, rivers changed course, and entire counties were flattened. Reports from that time estimate that over 800,000 people lost their lives as a direct or indirect result of the quake. That number, though difficult to confirm with modern methods, remains the highest toll ever attributed to a single earthquake. Towns like Huaxian and Weinan were reduced to rubble. Survivors faced secondary tragedies, famine, homelessness, and outbreaks of disease in the quake's aftermath. The scale of loss reshaped the demographic makeup of the region for generations. This event occurred centuries before seismology existed, which makes its documentation even more remarkable. Local officials, monks, and scholars recorded their observations with chilling precision. They spoke of the sky changing color, of thunderous sounds beneath the earth, and of mountains dancing. In an age with no emergency infrastructure, no rescue systems, and little understanding of tectonics, the response relied on the most basic human instinct: survival. Families rebuilt, often in the same loess cliffs that had failed them. And even though the Ming government responded by suspending taxes and dispatching aid, it took years for the region to recover in any meaningful way. The Shaanxi earthquake wasn't just a physical catastrophe, it was a cultural rupture. In Chinese historical memory, it symbolized both nature's power and the fragility of human society. And yet outside of China, the world barely knows it happened. This event remains a stark reminder that the most destructive disasters don't always come with modern headlines. They sometimes arrive silently, under ancient skies. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia unleashed such overwhelming force that it altered global climate, reshaped regional civilizations, and caused one of the most widespread environmental disasters in recorded history. On April 10th, the volcano roared to life with a cataclysmic series of explosions, culminating in a blast so massive it was heard over 2,000 kilometers away. The eruption released an estimated 160 cubic kilometers of ash and debris into the atmosphere, making it the most powerful volcanic eruption in at least the last 2,000 years. Entire villages on the island of Sumbawa were instantly obliterated as pyroclastic flows swept across the landscape. The mountain itself lost over a third of its height, collapsing into a vast caldera. In the immediate region, tens of thousands of people were overwhelmed by ashfall, tsunamis, and crop failure. But the true scope of the disaster only became clear as months passed and its effects rippled across the planet. The vast quantity of volcanic material ejected into the stratosphere created a veil of aerosols that reduced sunlight worldwide. Temperatures dropped significantly in both hemispheres, triggering what became known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. Across Europe and North America, unexpected frosts in June and snow in July led to failed harvests, skyrocketing food prices, and widespread famine. In Ireland, India, and China, similar agricultural breakdowns led to mass starvation and outbreaks of disease. The eruption's climatic consequences triggered chaos far beyond Asia. In Switzerland, Lord Byron, trapped indoors by gloomy skies and freezing temperatures, wrote dark poetry that would inspire the Gothic genre. Mary Shelley, similarly stranded, conceived the story of Frankenstein. But the real horror was happening elsewhere, where starvation drove social unrest and migration on an unprecedented scale. In parts of Germany, desperate people rioted over bread.
In the newly founded United States, many abandoned New England entirely, fleeing westward in search of more stable weather and farmland. Mount Tambora's eruption wasn't just a local event, it was global. Yet it remains surprisingly under-discussed compared to more famous eruptions like Krakatoa or Vesuvius. Part of that's timing. It occurred during the Napoleonic Wars when Europe was preoccupied with human conflict. But Tambora proved that nature could rival any battlefield in terms of devastation. Entire cultures were shaken, and the delicate balance between earth and atmosphere was upended for years.
The 1883 eruption of Krakatoa is remembered not just for its raw force, but for the eerie, almost mythic way it echoed across the globe. Located in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, the Krakatoa volcanic island had long been considered volatile, but on August 26th and 27th, it proved itself utterly catastrophic. A series of titanic explosions culminated in one of the loudest sounds in recorded history, reportedly heard over 4,800 kilometers away in Australia and the island of Rodrigues near Mauritius. The final eruption obliterated most of the island and triggered towering tsunamis, some reaching 40 meters high, that struck coastal settlements with little to no warning. The scale of destruction was apocalyptic. Entire villages were erased along the shores of Java and Sumatra. Ships were hurled inland, and trees were ripped from the ground. Over 36,000 people lost their lives, most of them swept away by the series of tsunamis. The water didn't just flood, it crushed, twisted, and dragged entire communities into the sea. In towns like Anjer and Maroc, survivors described walls of water carrying flaming debris, boiling ash, and black clouds that blotted out the sun. Days after the eruption, the ocean still bubbled and steamed. The atmosphere was so thick with volcanic particles that sunlight dimmed and temperatures dropped worldwide. What made Krakatoa especially memorable was how it resonated far beyond Indonesia. The eruption injected millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, scattering light and producing vivid sunsets and bizarre optical phenomena across the globe. In London, skies turned crimson and stayed that way for weeks, prompting artists and writers to document the strange twilight. Some scholars even believe that Edvard Munch's famous painting, The Scream, was inspired by one of these post-Krakatoa sunsets, with its swirling, blood-red sky. Scientific interest in Krakatoa was intense and immediate. It marked one of the first times an international network of telegraphs and scientific observations captured a natural disaster in near real time. The eruption's shockwaves circled the Earth 7 times and were recorded by barometers around the world. In a way, it was one of the earliest global events, felt not just physically, but culturally and intellectually. Krakatoa became a case study in geophysics, climate science, and even acoustics, its impact spanning disciplines and continents. This wasn't just a volcanic explosion, it was a planetary moment, a reminder that when the Earth speaks at full volume, it can silence everything else.
The 1900 Galveston Hurricane struck with such unexpected fury that it reshaped both the city and the American psyche. On September 8th, a powerful Category 4 storm made landfall on the Texas coast, catching the bustling port city of Galveston almost entirely unprepared. With wind speeds estimated at 145 miles per hour and a storm surge over 15 feet high, the hurricane overwhelmed the low-lying barrier island, reducing entire neighborhoods to splinters in a matter of hours. In the absence of modern forecasting and warning systems, most residents had no idea what was coming until it was too late. At the time, Galveston was considered the Wall Street of the South, a wealthy, thriving trade hub with grand homes, businesses, and aspirations of becoming the next great American metropolis. But the storm turned that vision to ruin almost instantly. Wooden buildings collapsed like kindling. People climbed into attics and rooftops to escape the rising water, only to be trapped by collapsing debris. The destruction was near total. Estimates suggest that over 8,000 people lost their lives, making it the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Bodies were initially buried at sea, but when they washed back ashore, massive funeral pyres were built across the city. grim symbols of a city struggling to cope with the scale of loss. In the aftermath, Galveston responded with a remarkable feat of engineering and willpower. The entire island was elevated by several feet, and a massive seawall, still standing today, was constructed to guard against future hurricanes. But despite these efforts, Galveston never fully recovered its status as a major port. Houston, further inland and seen as safer, grew in prominence while Galveston's economic influence faded. The storm didn't just change geography, it shifted the course of Texas history. The Galveston hurricane revealed how vulnerable modern societies remained to nature's wrath, even at the dawn of the 20th century. The tragedy spurred major changes in how the U.S. approached weather prediction and disaster preparedness. It prompted the federal government to invest more in meteorological infrastructure and eventually helped lay the groundwork for the modern National Weather Service. But even today, over a century later, the Galveston disaster remains a chilling reminder that even developed cities can be brought to their knees in a single night. It wasn't just a storm, it was a reckoning, and its story is still etched into the soul of the Gulf Coast.
The 1906 San Francisco earthquake wasn't just a geological event. It was a defining moment in American urban history. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, the ground beneath Northern California split open with terrifying speed, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs. The quake, estimated at magnitude 7.9, ruptured nearly 300 miles of the San Andreas Fault. In San Francisco, one of the largest and fastest-growing cities in the United States at the time, the violent shaking lasted less than a minute, but its effects unraveled the city for years to come. The destruction began instantly. Buildings pancaked, streets cracked wide open, and entire blocks of the city collapsed. But the real devastation came in the hours that followed, when fires, ignited by broken gas mains and damaged chimneys, swept through the ruins. With the city's water mains shattered, firefighters had no way to stop the blaze. Some desperate attempts to create fire breaks, like using dynamite, only made things worse. Over the next 3 days, fire consumed more than 500 city blocks, leaving a smoldering wasteland in place of neighborhoods, businesses, and landmarks. More than 3,000 people lost their lives, and over 200,000 were left homeless, nearly 3/4 of the city's population at the time. Survivors set up makeshift camps in parks and beaches, and tent cities remained long after the initial cleanup. The disaster response was chaotic but determined. Federal troops were brought in to maintain order and assist in recovery efforts. Some of the early footage of the aftermath still survives today, giving us haunting visual evidence of a modern city brought low by natural forces. What makes the 1906 earthquake especially notable is how it exposed weaknesses, not just in buildings, but in systems. San Francisco's infrastructure, designed for prosperity, buckled under pressure. The chaos highlighted the need for more rigorous building codes, fireproof materials, and urban planning that accounted for seismic risk. It also gave birth to an early understanding of earthquake science in the United States, fueling research into tectonics and fault lines for decades to come. The 1931 China floods stand as one of the deadliest and most extensive natural disasters in human history. Centered around the Yangtze, Huai, and Yellow Rivers, these floods weren't a single moment of catastrophe, but a slow-moving chain of destruction that unfolded over months. Beginning in the winter of 1930 with unusually heavy snowfalls and continuing with torrential spring and summer rains, the rivers gradually swelled until they could no longer be contained. By August of 1931, the Yangtze had risen far beyond its banks, and millions of square kilometers of farmland, towns, and entire cities were underwater. This was not just a seasonal flood. Dikes collapsed, reservoirs overflowed, and even major urban centers like Wuhan became submerged for weeks. In some areas, water levels were recorded at over 16 meters above average, creating a vast inland sea that swallowed roads, fields, and railways. With modern estimates suggesting that as many as 4 million people may have lost their lives due to drowning, starvation, or disease, the 1931 floods eclipsed nearly every other natural disaster in sheer human toll.
The societal consequences were immense. Entire provinces were paralyzed, infrastructure vanished, crops were destroyed during a critical planting season, which led to long-lasting food shortages. Refugees by the millions moved inland or clung to makeshift rafts in hilltop shelters. Disease spread rapidly. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid broke out in relief camps. The nationalist government, already strained by political instability and regional warlordism, struggled to mount an adequate response. International aid arrived slowly, but the scale of need overwhelmed even the most generous efforts. The cause of the disaster wasn't just natural, it was compounded by human decisions. Deforestation and poor water management had weakened the land's ability to absorb rainfall. Centuries-old dikes, long neglected or weakened by silt and erosion, were no match for the rising tide. The flood exposed how vulnerable one of the world's most populous nations could be when basic infrastructure failed to keep pace with environmental change. In Chinese history, the 1931 floods are remembered with a mix of sorrow and silence. They occurred during a turbulent time between the fall of the Qing dynasty and the full rise of Mao's communist regime, so for decades the tragedy remained underreported outside academic circles. But for those who lived through it, the waters were a cruel equalizer. No rank or wealth could buy safety. The earth shifted, the skies opened, and everything human seemed to vanish beneath the current.
The 1970 Bhola Cyclone was not only the most devastating tropical storm to ever strike the Indian subcontinent, it became a turning point in regional history. On the evening of November 12th, a powerful cyclone swept over the Bay of Bengal and struck the densely populated coastal areas of East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. With wind speeds exceeding 115 miles per hour and a storm surge as high as 10 meters in some regions, the cyclone didn't just batter the coastline, it erased entire communities from the map. What made Bhola so catastrophic wasn't just the force of the wind, but the geography and human vulnerability it collided with. The low-lying Ganges Delta was home to millions of people living in fishing villages and subsistence farms. Most lived in homes that could not withstand even moderate storms. When the surge arrived in the dark of night, many were asleep or unaware of its approach. In minutes, villages were submerged, boats, livestock, and homes were swept away. The sheer speed and force of the water left no time to react, and by the time the sun rose, entire districts had vanished. Estimates of the loss vary, but it is widely accepted that between 300,000 and 500,000 lives were lost, making it the deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history. The region was left in chaos. Infrastructure was destroyed, communication lines were severed, and aid could not reach the most devastated areas for days. Survivors faced hunger, contaminated water, and outbreaks of disease. Mass graves were dug on the spot. It was not just a natural calamity, but a humanitarian collapse. But the storm's aftermath didn't end with recovery. It led to revolution. The central government in West Pakistan, perceived as slow and indifferent in its response, faced enormous criticism. The cyclone intensified long-standing political tensions between East and West Pakistan. Just months later, a national election brought the Awami League, a Bengali nationalist party, to a landslide victory. When the ruling powers refused to honor the result, civil unrest escalated into open conflict. Within a year, the Bangladesh Liberation War erupted, and by 1971, a new nation was born. In that sense, the Bhola Cyclone was more than a weather event. It was a historical rupture, a storm so powerful it didn't just change landscapes or end lives, it changed borders and governments. For Bangladesh, its memory is seared into national consciousness, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. And in the global context, it remains a haunting case study in how the fury of nature can expose the limits of leadership and the fragility of political order.
The 1984 Bhopal Gas Tragedy was not the result of a storm, earthquake, or flood. It was a man-made disaster, invisible yet devastating. On the night of December 2nd, a cloud of toxic gas escaped from the Union Carbide pesticide plant in the central Indian city of Bhopal. What began as a chemical leak quickly escalated into one of the worst industrial catastrophes in modern history.
Within hours, a dense plume of methyl isocyanate spread across the sleeping city, silently suffocating tens of thousands and poisoning hundreds of thousands more. There was no warning system, no sirens, no evacuation plan, and no protective equipment. Residents were caught entirely unaware. People awoke coughing, their eyes burning, gasping for air as they stumbled out of their homes into streets filled with confusion and panic. Many collapsed where they stood. The gas was heavier than air. It sank into the narrow lanes and low-lying areas of Bhopal, clinging to the ground, ensuring that escape on foot was nearly impossible. Estimates of the human toll vary, but at least 3,000 people lost their lives within the first few days. In the years that followed, the number grew into the tens of thousands as victims succumbed to long-term effects, respiratory problems, blindness, organ damage, and birth defects among children born to exposed families. Over 500,000 people were affected in some way. The disaster overwhelmed hospitals and morgues. The city's resources were stretched beyond their limits, and for many survivors, medical care remained inadequate even decades later. What made the Bhopal tragedy especially horrific was how preventable it was. Investigations later revealed multiple safety lapses at the plant: broken alarms, malfunctioning scrubbers, understaffed night crews, and inadequate maintenance of highly volatile chemicals. It was a web of negligence that unraveled in the worst possible way. Union Carbide's management denied responsibility for years, and compensation efforts were slow, limited, and widely criticized as insufficient. Legal battles dragged on for decades, leaving victims disillusioned and justice incomplete. The legacy of Bhopal is not just the scale of human suffering, it's the haunting lesson about corporate accountability and environmental safety. It raised global awareness about the dangers of chemical industries operating near population centers. Yet even today in Bhopal, the ground and water near the old factory site remain contaminated. The disaster never truly ended. It just faded from international headlines while its consequences endured in silence. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a failure of responsibility, oversight, and humanity.
The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was one of the most devastating natural events of the 21st century, striking with little warning and unimaginable force on the morning of December 26th. It began with a massive undersea earthquake off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, measuring a staggering magnitude 9.1. The tectonic plates beneath the Indian Ocean shifted abruptly, unleashing an immense amount of energy. Within minutes, a wall of water began racing outward in all directions at the speed of a jetliner. What made the tsunami so catastrophic was its sheer reach and the element of surprise. Unlike cyclones or hurricanes, which can be tracked and forecasted, tsunamis often offer no visual signs until it's too late. As the water raced toward the shores of Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and even distant parts of Africa, millions of people were enjoying what seemed like an ordinary morning. Then, the sea suddenly receded, a deceptive warning sign, followed moments later by towering waves up to 30 meters high. In a matter of hours, entire coastlines were erased. Coastal villages, resorts, fishing ports, and urban centers were hit without mercy. Boats were hurled inland like toys, trains derailed, hotels crumbled. People were swept off beaches, streets, and rooftops. The power of the water was total, tearing down structures, uprooting trees, and dragging everything in its path back into the ocean. More than 230,000 lives were lost across 14 countries, with Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Thailand suffering the worst damage. Millions more were left homeless, injured, or mourning lost relatives. The global response was massive. Humanitarian aid poured in from all corners of the world. It was one of the first disasters of the digital age, and the images, shaky handheld videos, photos of survivors, satellite footage of submerged coastlines, spread across the globe within hours.
But while the outpouring of support brought temporary relief, recovery was slow and uneven. Many coastal communities struggled for years to rebuild their homes and economies, and in some cases, trauma lingered far longer than physical damage. In the aftermath, one glaring absence stood out. The Indian Ocean had no tsunami warning system in place. Unlike the Pacific, where warning networks were well established, this region had virtually no means to detect or alert the public. That failure led to a global reevaluation of disaster readiness. Within months, international agencies began constructing a regional tsunami early warning system designed to prevent such a tragedy from happening again without notice. The 2004 tsunami wasn't just a regional catastrophe, it was a global wake-up call. It reminded the modern world that even with all our technology, we remain vulnerable to the raw forces of nature. And for those who stood by the sea that morning, it changed everything in a single, shattering wave.
The 2010 Haiti earthquake struck with brutal suddenness and exposed the fragility of a nation already burdened by poverty and instability. On January 12th at 4:53 p.m. local time, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake ruptured just 25 kilometers southwest of the capital, Port-au-Prince. Though moderate in size compared to other seismic events, the quake's shallow depth and proximity to densely populated areas turned it into a catastrophe of staggering proportions. Within seconds, buildings began to collapse across the capital. Entire neighborhoods turned to rubble, homes, schools, hospitals, and government buildings crumbled. The presidential palace, the national cathedral, the main prison, and much of Haiti's infrastructure was destroyed. With no building codes enforced and decades of poorly constructed concrete structures, the devastation was complete and indiscriminate. Streets became impassable, communication lines failed, and the city was plunged into chaos. In the days that followed, a humanitarian crisis unfolded. More than 230,000 people are estimated to have lost their lives, while over 300,000 were injured. Around 1.5 million were left without shelter. Makeshift camps sprouted in parks, open spaces, and on the streets as survivors struggled to find food, clean water, and medical aid. Rescue operations were severely hampered by blocked roads and damaged airports. For a country with limited resources even before the disaster, the scale of the response needed was unprecedented. International aid agencies, NGOs, and foreign governments quickly mobilized, sending supplies, doctors, engineers, and rescue teams. But coordination proved difficult. Haiti's government was paralyzed, and many relief efforts stumbled under logistical confusion. Despite the influx of help, many Haitians went days without assistance, fueling frustration and despair. Meanwhile, hospitals operated in parking lots, and injuries worsened without proper care. The earthquake didn't just damage buildings, it shattered an already fragile society. Thousands of children were orphaned, countless records and documents were lost. Diseases like cholera, previously unknown in Haiti, broke out months later due to unsanitary conditions in refugee camps, compounding the tragedy. Efforts to rebuild were massive, but progress was slow. Billions were pledged, but the effectiveness of the aid became a subject of debate. Years later, many families remained in temporary shelters, and much of the international funding had yet to translate into lasting infrastructure. The Haiti earthquake is remembered not only for its physical destruction, but for its broader implications. It revealed how vulnerability is shaped by more than just natural forces. It's about history, governance, inequality, and resilience. While the tremor lasted less than a minute, its impact will echo through generations.
The 2011 Tōhoku earthquake and tsunami wasn't just Japan's most powerful recorded seismic event, it was a disaster that rippled across the globe. On March 11th at 2:46 p.m. local time, a colossal 9.0 magnitude earthquake struck off the northeastern coast of Honshu. It was the fourth largest earthquake in modern history, and even in a nation as seismically prepared as Japan, its impact was overwhelming. But the shaking was only the beginning. Roughly 30 minutes later, a massive tsunami slammed into the coastline. In some areas, waves reached heights of over 40 meters and traveled up to 10 kilometers inland. Towns and cities were engulfed with astonishing speed. Roads were peeled away. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath muddy torrents. The water swept away homes, trains, cars, and anything standing in its path. Even concrete seawalls and advanced defense systems proved no match for the force of nature unleashed that day. The combined earthquake and tsunami resulted in the loss of over 15,000 lives, with thousands more injured or missing. More than 500,000 people were displaced. Communities like Rikuzen Takata and Minami Sanriku were nearly wiped off the map. Survivors faced freezing temperatures, broken communication networks, and shortages of food and water. Emergency services, although rapid and organized, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the destruction. And then came the secondary crisis, Fukushima. The tsunami disabled the cooling systems of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, leading to core meltdowns in 3 reactors. Radioactive materials were released into the environment, triggering evacuations and long-term exclusion zones. It was the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl, reigniting global debates over nuclear safety and changing Japan's own energy policy almost overnight. Japan's response, despite the chaos, was marked by order, discipline, and resilience. Volunteers flooded in to help, shelters were quickly organized, and international aid was welcomed. But the psychological impact was deep. A nation long accustomed to natural disasters was left confronting the limits of even its meticulous preparedness. For months, the images of flooded coastal towns, cracked highways, and the haunting silence of the exclusion zones dominated the news. The Tōhoku disaster stands as a sobering reminder. Even the most developed nations with cutting-edge infrastructure and planning are not immune to nature's most extreme events. It was a moment of global solidarity and scientific scrutiny, and one that reshaped how the world understands earthquakes, tsunamis, and the fragile balance of modern technology.
The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines was one of the most powerful volcanic events of the 20th century, and few saw it coming. For over 500 years, the mountain had been silent, its slopes covered in thick forests and dotted with remote villages. But in June 1991, that silence was shattered when the volcano roared to life, sending ash and gas high into the atmosphere and altering the global climate in the process. Signs of unrest began months earlier. Steam vents, earthquakes, and minor explosions hinted at activity beneath the surface. Still, many underestimated the danger. Then, on June 15th, Pinatubo unleashed a cataclysmic eruption. A column of ash, 35 kilometers high, burst into the sky. Pyroclastic flows surged down the slopes at terrifying speeds, destroying everything in their path. Entire towns were buried. The surrounding landscape was transformed into a gray, lifeless wasteland. What made the eruption especially devastating was its timing. Just days before, Typhoon Yunya had arrived, dumping heavy rains across the region. When volcanic ash and rain combined, they created thick, concrete-like mud flows known as lahars. These flows swept through valleys and lowlands, collapsing homes, bridges, and roads long after the eruption had ended. The lahar threat persisted for years, reshaping rivers and displacing entire communities. Clark Air Base, a major U.S. military installation just 15 kilometers from the volcano, was heavily damaged. The eruption hastened the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the Philippines and marked a turning point in the country's post-colonial military history. In total, more than 800 people lost their lives, mostly from roof collapses and the aftermath of mud flows. Over 100,000 were forced to evacuate, many never returning to their homes. But Pinatubo's impact wasn't limited to the Philippines. The eruption expelled nearly 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a layer of aerosols that circled the globe. These particles reflected sunlight and caused average global temperatures to drop by about 0.5 degrees Celsius over the next year. Sunsets became redder, skies hazier, and scientists used the event to better understand the link between volcanoes and climate. Unlike many other disasters, the eruption of Pinatubo showcased both tragedy and success. Though the destruction was immense, early warnings from Filipino and American volcanologists saved tens of thousands of lives. It was a testament to the power of science, preparation, and cooperation in the face of a seemingly unstoppable force.